How France's wars bankrupted its monarchy. Before the guillotine, before the slogans of liberty and equality, before the streets of Paris ran with revolutionary fervor, there was a balance sheet. The French monarchy didn't collapse because it lost the loyalty of its people overnight. It collapsed because, over centuries, it lost control of its finances. At the heart of that financial unraveling was war, the endless pursuit of military glory that drained the wealth of an entire nation. From the lavish campaigns of Louis XIV to the ideological crusades of Louis XVI, France's kings waged wars that shaped Europe but destroyed their own fiscal foundations. What followed was one of history's most dramatic lessons in economics, that no throne, no matter how divine, can outspend its credibility. In the late 17th century, France was the richest and most powerful kingdom in Europe. Its population was enormous, its agriculture fertile, its culture dominant. The state appeared unshakable, anchored by divine monarchy and the magnificence of Versailles. Yet the Sun King, Louis XIV, saw military conquest as an extension of royal glory. Between 1667 and 1714, France fought in three major continental wars: the War of Devolution, the 9 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish Succession. Each war was fought for prestige and territory. Each victory expanded France's influence. But each campaign also consumed staggering amounts of money. By 1714, France had spent more than half a century's worth of royal revenue on warfare alone. At the time, the French fiscal system was medieval in design, but imperial in ambition. Taxes were levied through corrupt intermediaries called tax farmers, who paid the crown up front for the right to collect taxes, then squeezed the people for profit. This meant that the more France fought, the more its citizens bled, literally on the battlefield and figuratively through taxes. To fund these wars, Louis XIV turned to an increasingly complex web of short-term loans, anticipating future tax revenue that never seemed to arrive. The monarchy's credit became a fragile illusion propped up by promises and royal authority rather than sustainable cash flow. By the time the Sun King died in 1715, he left behind a dazzling empire, a colossal mountain of debt. The number was staggering even by modern standards, around 2 billion livres, equivalent to roughly 150% of France's annual GDP at the time. The monarchy's prestige remained intact, but its finances were in ruins. When Louis XIV's great-grandson, Louis XV, took the throne, France faced a paradox. Outwardly, it remained Europe's cultural and political center. Beneath that veneer, the crown was bankrupt. The first man to attempt a rescue was John Law, a Scottish economist and gambler with radical ideas about money. Law believed that France's problem wasn't a lack of wealth, it was a lack of liquidity. Gold and silver were finite, he argued, but paper credit could expand indefinitely. In 1716, he convinced the regent, Philippe d'Orléans, to establish the Banque Générale, a private bank that issued paper notes backed by the promise of the state. Soon, Law created the Mississippi Company, a trading venture that promised vast riches from France's North American colonies. Investors flooded in, fueled by cheap credit and wild optimism. It was, in essence, the first modern financial bubble. And like every bubble since, it relied on faith in perpetual growth, in infinite profit, and in the credibility of the crown itself. By 1720, the illusion shattered. The Mississippi bubble burst, wiping out fortunes across Europe. The public, burned by the crash, lost faith not only in law, but in paper money itself. The episode left a deep scar on France's collective memory, a nation traumatized by its own experiment with modern finance. For the next half-century, France would refuse to trust paper credit again, clinging instead to hard coin and conservative fiscal management. But this conservatism came at a cost. When the next generation of wars arrived, France lacked the flexibility and trust needed to finance them sustainably. The 18th century was an age of global competition. Britain and France battled not only for European dominance but for empire territories, trade routes, and resources across the world. Louis XV, inheriting his great-grandfather's ambition but not his political discipline, led France into the 7 Years' War 1756 to 1763, a truly global conflict that stretched from Europe to India to North America. The war was catastrophic for France. Militarily, it lost its colonies in Canada and much of its influence overseas. Financially, it spent more than 1.5 billion livres, a figure so enormous that it consumed decades of revenue. When the war ended, France's economy was crippled. The British emerged as the new maritime superpower, and France's pride was shattered. Yet, rather than retrench, the French elite, both royal and intellectual, became obsessed with restoring national prestige. This obsession reached its tragic climax under Louis XVI, a ruler more curious than capable. When American revolutionaries rose against British rule, France saw an irresistible opportunity: revenge against its old enemy. In 1778, France entered the American Revolutionary War, supplying troops, ships, and gold to the rebel colonies. The decision was geopolitically satisfying but economically suicidal. By 1783, France had spent another 1.3 billion livres, more than double its annual revenue. The monarchy had effectively mortgaged its future for symbolic glory. When the final bills came due, the crown found itself trapped in a system that could no longer sustain itself. The deeper problem wasn't the wars themselves, was the structure of France's fiscal system. Taxes were heavy, but they were distributed with staggering inequality. The nobility and clergy, who owned vast estates and most of the wealth, paid little to nothing. The burden fell on peasants, merchants, and the emerging middle class, those least able to bear it. The monarchy's revenue system was riddled with inefficiencies. Local tax collectors skimmed off the top. Exemptions were bought and sold. Corruption was normalized. Even as France's economy grew in the 18th century, its state remained fiscally medieval. Several finance ministers tried to reform it. And Robert Jacques Turgot sought to simplify taxes and cut royal spending. He was dismissed. Jacques Necker, a Swiss banker, published the crown's finances for the first time, revealing the depth of the crisis to the public. He was dismissed, too. Each reformer ran into the same immovable wall: the aristocracy. The privileged classes, who benefited most from the old system, refused to give up their exemptions. In effect, France was governed by a coalition of elites determined to protect their privileges even as the state collapsed around them. By the late 1780s, interest payments on the national debt consumed nearly half of all royal revenue. In modern terms, imagine a government spending every dollar of tax collected on debt service before paying for the army, roads, or even its own administration. The monarchy was no longer ruling the country, was ruled by its creditors. In 1788, France reached a breaking point. The treasury was empty. Loans dried up. The financial markets, mostly Parisian bankers, refused to extend new credit without structural reform. With no money and no legitimacy left, Louis XVI resorted to the unthinkable. He summoned the Estates General, an assembly of clergy, nobility, and commoners that hadn't met in 175 years. His goal was simple: to raise new taxes. But politics rarely goes according to plan. The meeting quickly turned into a platform for national grievance. The Third Estate, presenting commoners, demanded real political power. When the king hesitated, they broke away, forming the National Assembly. Within weeks, France was in open revolt. The storming of the Bastille in July 1789 became the symbol of a broader revolution, not just against royal authority, but against a system of financial and social injustice centuries in the making. When Louis XVI lost control of his credit, he lost control of his country. The guillotine, which would eventually claim his life, was less a political instrument than a metaphor for financial collapse, the sudden, irreversible consequence of decades of mismanagement. The French Revolution wasn't simply a political uprising, it was a financial reckoning. In essence, it represented the world's first modern sovereign default, driven by social inequality. By the early 1790s, the revolutionary government tried to solve the fiscal crisis through a familiar tool: paper money. The assignats, backed by confiscated church lands, were issued in massive quantities. Predictably, they lost value. Inflation spiraled. Trust, once again, evaporated. France had come full circle from the Mississippi bubble to the revolutionary hyperinflation, trapped in a recurring cycle of financial overreach and loss of faith. Yet amid the chaos, a new fiscal order emerged. The old privileges were abolished. Taxation was standardized. For the first time, France began to build a modern financial state, one accountable, at least in theory, to its citizens rather than its aristocracy. It took revolution, blood, and ruin to achieve what competent fiscal reform might have achieved peacefully decades earlier. Looking back, France's collapse holds lessons far beyond its own time. First, debt is not inherently destructive, but debt without trust is. France's problem wasn't merely that it borrowed. It was that its borrowing was built on fragile promises and unequal foundations. Second, systems of privilege are fiscally unsustainable. When the few reap the benefits and the many bear the costs, legitimacy erodes faster than credit. And third, military glory is the most seductive and dangerous form of public spending. Empires fall not because they lose wars, but because they keep winning them until victory costs more than defeat. In that sense, the story of France's monarchy is not ancient history. It's a warning written in gold leaf and debt recorza, reminder that political power, once detached from fiscal reality, eventually meets its reckoning. When Louis XVI went to the scaffold in 1793, he wasn't just paying for the sins of tyranny. He was paying the accumulated interest of a system that had lived beyond its means for 200 years. Versailles still stands a monument to beauty and vanity, but beneath its gilded ceilings lies the echo of empty coffers. Every mirror in the Hall of Mirrors reflects not only France's grandeur, but also its downfall. The triumph of image over balance, spectacle over solvency. History tends to remember revolutions as moral awakenings, but behind every uprising lies an unpaid bill. France's wars may have made it glorious, but its debts made it human. And in the end, that's the true lesson of the fallen crown. That every empire, no matter how divine it claims to be, must still balance its books.